Hey folks, welcome to a very special episode of Sound Decisions here on Passion for Sound. If you're new to the channel, I put out Sound Decisions episodes every now and again when there's a reason to do so, and they're different from my normal content, which is reviews, in that they're actually more focused on understanding things about our hobby. Sometimes it's interviews with manufacturers, sometimes it's a piece of information that I've come across, something that I want to share with other enthusiasts who love music and listen to music through all sorts of gear. The reason this episode is a bit special and a bit different is that it's the first time I've been able to do a relatively large scale, at least for me, a relatively large scale blind listening test, and that was thanks to the recently held Melbourne HiFi Show. The HiFi Show is put on by StereoNet Australia, so I want to say a huge thanks to them for creating the event, and I'd also like to say a huge thanks to the team at Radiance Audio Visual, who are the importers and distributors of Cord, Mezza and Earman products. They've supported the channel before by lending me gear to review, and on this occasion they were kind enough to give me a corner of their booth at the HiFi Show where we could run a test. In addition to that, I needed someone to provide me with some gear so we could have two identical setups, and that's also why I was at the Radiance AV stand, because they provided a TT2 to go along with my TT2, as well as two pairs of Mezza Empyreans for the listening tests. So again, I want to say a huge thanks to Radiance Audio Visual, particularly Chris who helped me put it together, and then of course to all of you who came along to the show and completed the listening test and the survey that followed. You're about to see the results of your hard work, and I thank you for the information you've provided to all of us. Finally, before I share with you what the setup was and of course what the results were, I wanted to share with you that I'm starting to formulate a bit of a plan, and specifically a plan that's going to allow for more of these types of tests in the future. So if you're in Melbourne, or it's easy for you to get to Melbourne, and you'd like to be involved in more of these sorts of tests in the future, then make sure you stay tuned until the end, where I talk about how I might be able to provide plenty of very interesting and hopefully exciting opportunities to anyone that can easily enough get to Melbourne for a daytime event, probably on a Sunday. But stay tuned and I'll explain that more later. For now though, let me tell you what this was all about. And I want to start by explaining why I did this. If you've watched this channel for a while, you'll know that I'm pretty heavily focused on subjective reviews. I talk about what I hear, what I like, my preferences, what other people's preferences might be and what they might like, but it's all largely subjective with the exception of some headphone frequency response measurements. As a result of that, I often get asked in the comments to provide data and evidence for the things that I'm hearing. And after many years of experience in the industry, now in the hobby because I'm not employed in the industry anymore, but after doing this for a very long time, I tend to trust my ears, and that's given me the belief that measurements don't tell us everything. But I also understand people's desires for data, because it's very hard to know what you can trust when there are things like placebo, expectation bias. All of those sorts of things are absolutely real and completely justified for people to be a bit skeptical. And so I saw this as an opportunity to actually get some data that was not going to be coloured by expectation biases, and that also took into account a wider range of people's impressions, preferences, their ability to hear different things, the whole gamut I hope to cover here. And so let's now talk about exactly what the setup was, and I'm deliberately not telling you what I was measuring because I want to take you on that journey. I'll show you some footage as we go through about the setup that we had here, and I apologise, the footage isn't up to my normal standard because the lighting and the general environment wasn't ideal, but the setup that we had was, as I said before, designed to be two identical systems for a blind listening setup. What that means is we had identical headphones. They were connected using identical headphone cables, and then connected up to two identical DAC and amp combos, in this case the Cord Hugo TT2. Without an M scaler, they were just the TT2 on their own, and for anyone familiar with the TT2, it's important to note that the crossfeed settings were set to 0, so there was no crossfeed being used. The filter settings were identical, and I regularly checked to make sure that none of those things had been changed. Once we go beyond the DAC though, so as you go sort of further up the source chain if you like, there was one variable different. And to keep this completely blind, nobody except me knew what that variable was. And of course, that's the thing we were looking to test to see if anybody heard a difference from this particular variable. And I'll of course reveal what that is shortly. But before we get there, let me tell you what the listeners were told before they took the test, because this was important too. We didn't want to colour their expectations. We didn't want to create false results. And so everybody was told pretty much what I've told you, that there were two identical setups from the headphone through to the DAC, and that there was one variable somewhere beyond the DAC, and that may or may not make a difference, and their job was to take a listen and decide if it did or it didn't. Something else that we instructed everybody to do, and it was very important, and one of the reasons why we chose the TT2, was to make sure that after they started the first listening test on whichever headphone they chose, that they then should match their volume from the first one to the second one. And that was why the TT2 was important, because it's got a numerical volume control. So if somebody chose a minus 22 dB volume on one, they could know that they were getting exactly the same volume out of the other one. So in other words, we aimed to remove as many variables as we could. There was one key variable outside of our control, and I'm going to address that shortly. But before we get there, let me give you some results. And the results were that we had a total of 65 people take the test and then answer the survey. There were a few that took the test and for whatever reason didn't complete the survey. That's completely fine. We spoke to some of them, so we got some anecdotal evidence, but they're of course not included in the data I'm going to show you. So 65 people gave us data on this test. And just to be clear, I wasn't one of them because I knew what was going on. From those 65 people that took the test, 83.1% heard a difference. So they listened to both with no idea what was different, and we're going to get to that later on in terms of what people's expectations might or might not have been. They listened to both, and at the end of it, 83.1% decided they could hear a difference. And I have to say, in talking to people about it, there was no doubt. It was either I can't hear a difference or I absolutely can hear a difference. I don't think I spoke to a single person in the entire time who came away saying, oh, I'm not so sure, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. Everybody seemed to have a really clear idea that they either did or that they didn't. Now, I just mentioned talking to people after they took the test. I should also make it very clear we did not tell anybody whether they were right or wrong. There actually is no right and wrong, but we didn't confirm for anybody what the variable was because we didn't want them to walk away and tell somebody else. So literally until the very end of the show, nobody knew what was going on under the covers except for me. And I'm actually going to show you, we had one of the people that did the listening test come back and unveil what was going on and discover it for himself. I'll show you that footage at the end. Now, I mentioned before that we had a variable that was a little bit out of our control, and that was noise. Being a hi-fi show, there was a lot of noise going on at times, and so we actually had a question in the survey for people to rate the noise at the time they did the test. We gave them 3 options, low, medium and high, with an example of what that meant. So low was kind of just a general background murmur of sound, people talking over in different booths. Medium was maybe a bit of extra noise from a bit of music playing somewhere. And a high level of noise was if there was loud music playing nearby, which quite often there was. What I found fascinating, and it went completely against my expectations, was that the levels of noise had absolutely no impact on people's ability to hear the difference. So whether it was low noise or high noise, they had pretty much the same responses, which is anywhere from that 80 to 85% range. Now, as you're looking at the graph on screen, I should mention that the medium level noise group, there was a bit of an outlier group in there. And so there's 2 things to take into account when you see the lower number from the medium noise group. One of them is that because we've got a relatively small sample size here, even just a few people choosing something different can skew the number in terms of percentages fairly significantly. Having said that, it's still over 80%, which in my mind means it's pretty definitive. But I should also mention that when I went back and looked through the data, and then I also confirmed this verbally the next day with the people that were at the booth at the time, when I went back and looked at the data, it was very clear that there was a group of 3 or 4 people that arrived all at the same time, did the test together, and then conferred on their responses before answering the survey. The reason I say that is because all of their responses were recorded in the survey via the timestamp within about a minute of one another. And unsurprisingly, they all had exactly the same answer. And so it's a bit disappointing in some ways because I think it's robbed them the ability to have their own individual preferences, and someone could easily have been skewed by what the others in the group were saying, particularly if one member was stronger, more experienced than the other, whatever the reasoning might be. Now, I wasn't there, I didn't see the group, so I don't know what the dynamic was in that conversation, and of course I've left that information in there. I've not culled any data from this because I think it's important to represent it completely transparently, but I wanted to flag that that's why the medium noise group have a slightly lower score, is because there is this cluster of outliers. And the reason I call them outliers is because they were a cluster that all said they didn't hear a difference. Whereas looking through the rest of the data, it was one here and it was one there that said they couldn't hear a difference. We very rarely, if ever, had 2 in a row that said they didn't hear a difference. So just take that into account when you look at the medium noise group. It's not that the medium noise somehow influenced people's ability to hear or not hear differences. It's that we had this little outlier group that just skewed the numbers a little bit. Another piece of interesting data that we collected was people's preferences. So after we captured the main, most important piece of data, which is, did you or did you not hear a difference? That's really the bit that mattered. But after that, I was interested to know if people had a preference. So we had the systems labelled configuration 1 and configuration 2, and we just asked which one did you like more? And this was really interesting to me, that we basically got a 50-50 split, as near as makes no difference. There were of course a few that said they have no preference, they could hear a difference, but it didn't really matter either way, and so that was interesting to me as well. is that it goes to show that preferences, maybe listening experiences, expectations of how a system should sound or not sound, all of those things are different for all of us. I also wanted to go a step further though and see if there was any consistency in why people chose configuration 1 or configuration 2. And this data was also very interesting to me. I'm going to read a bit into this, and I recognize that I'm absolutely reading into it. I'm just theorizing and speculating on the causes. But what I did was I asked them to say in just a few words why they preferred the one they chose, regardless if it was configuration 1 or 2. I then filtered the data into those that preferred configuration 1 and those that preferred configuration 2, and from there I looked at if there were any common themes in what they said. Now, to do this, I've had to interpret their responses a little bit because everyone uses slightly different words, but I've pulled together things like cleaner, more detailed, more spacious, more open. Certain things I've clustered together. So just to be clear, the cleaner and more detailed I clustered together, spacious and more open I clustered together. So I've made a few calls there. I recognize that I am messing with the data a little bit. This was really just to provide any insight if there was any, or to see if there was none at all. And ultimately what I saw as I went through this data was two things. One of them is that how we describe what we hear, how we perceive what we hear, is not always clear cut. So what you might think of as cleaner and more detailed could be different to what I think of as cleaner and more detailed. What you think is smoother and warmer might be different to what I think of as smoother and warmer. There are multiple factors that are very hard to define in this hobby. For example, if you look at the graphs, and I know it's hard to read on the small screen, but both groups rated pretty highly that the configuration that they preferred, whichever one it was a bit cleaner and more detailed sounding. And I totally get where they're coming from, because one of the presentations, configuration 1, has a slightly more spacious sound that separates the instruments better, and to me allows me to hear each individual instrument a little bit better. Configuration 2, on the other hand, has a more forward presentation, a little bit flatter, and the result of that is that you can actually hear more of the details more because they're pushed forward at you. Personally, I wouldn't describe that as being cleaner and more detailed, but I absolutely get why some people did. It's more present and in some ways more available, even though it's not as well separated and not as well defined. And this is where the challenge comes into our hobby in terms of describing what we hear. Two things that really did stand out to me from the data is that I found that the group that preferred configuration 1, many of them cited the sense of space in that configuration, whereas very few, maybe a couple, mentioned space in the configuration 2 setup. And so that gave me a sense that the people that preferred configuration 1 probably listened for space in their demo listening, whereas those preferring configuration 2, it seemed put less emphasis on the space and maybe more emphasis on other things like the availability of details. As I said before, that more forward presentation brought that forward. The more forward presentation also changes the sense of energy and dynamics in the sound. And so it did show a bit of a separation in the way people listen to music and what they're listening for. The final thing that was clearly evident, and you can see it here on screen, is that the people that listened to configuration 1 had more consistently the same responses. If you look at the results for configuration 2, there's much more spread. There are more answers that came up as a 1 or a 2 or a 3, and less that started reaching 5s and 6s and 7s and 8s. In the configuration 1 group, there was a bit more consensus between them. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and completely speculate. I recognise that I'm speculating, but I get the sense that what we might have been seeing here was that those preferring configuration 1 may have actually been more used to critical listening, may have been more focused on specific characteristics that they went for, and that those preferring configuration 2 are maybe less experienced listeners, maybe less experienced with headphones. And I know this sounds like I'm saying that the people that said configuration 2 are wrong. That's absolutely not where I'm coming from. My point is that as I've talked to a lot of people in this hobby, the things that we listen to and listen for and that we focus on and put weight and value on, those things tend to evolve over our time in the hobby, in my experience. And not just my experience personally, but those I talk to as well. And so I wonder if that's a part of the split. Configuration 2 on first listen can come across really fun, but maybe those that are listening more through the music are actually preferring what they're hearing from configuration 1 because they're listening for those things like space, like the three-dimensionality and the separation of sounds, rather than that immediate wall of detail. Just a theory, I'm not suggesting anyone's right or wrong. What matters most is that you enjoy the music the way you have it set up. And so let's now move past my speculation and share a bit of speculation from the listeners. The one final thing I asked people to predict was what they thought we'd changed in that source chain. So in other words, what was the one thing before the DAC that we had changed as a single variable? And the answers kind of surprised me again. partly because they were so varied and spread out, but also because most people thought that the variable we changed was connecting via, say, USB on one side and optical or BNC/coaxial SPDIF on the other side. So people thought it was the connection protocol that was the most likely to cause it. I say people, each individual person had their own answers, of course, but the most responses that came in thought that it was the connection protocol having the impact. The next largest group was the file format used, and the example in the survey was, say, FLAC versus DSD. Then we got to the type of power supply used, so whether it was a switch mode power supply on one side and a linear power supply on the other. And then the final two that had a significant number was the type of cable used, so in other words, a high quality versus a low quality digital interconnect. And then the final most significant group thought that it was maybe a software or firmware change in either the transport or in the DACs themselves. And so no doubt at this point, you want to know for yourself what was causing these changes. And so before I show you the reveal video, I just want to remind you of the results so far. So we've had everybody do a completely blind listening test, knowing that there was a variable in the chain, but not knowing if it was going to make a difference, and that their job was just to decide if it did or if it did not make a difference. We had 65 respondents, and 83.1% of them confidently said they heard a difference. And so to find out what was causing that difference, we asked Pete, who is a viewer of the channel that I hadn't met before until this afternoon. This was late on Sunday. It was actually Chris from Radiance Audio Visual who said, "Hey, that's Pete over there. He was busting to know what was going on under the shroud." And so we called him over and asked if he wanted to find out. So let me show you now what Pete discovered as he unwrapped and removed the shrouding around our blind setup. Okay, hey folks, it's the end of the Melbourne HiFi Show. I've been doing the listening test for the last 3 days, and what we've now got is one of the visitors to the show that was kind enough to come and do the listening test has now agreed to also unwrap the blind setup and share with all of us what was actually going on under the shroud. So I'm going to turn it around to Peter, and he's going to explore and find out what was going on. All right, so Peter, go for it.
Hello, guys. So what do we got here? USB cables. So what are the two brands that we've got here, guys?
Okay, so we've got the Supra, I'll come down here, actually we've got the Supra Excalibur going in here. So this is about a $100 cable if I remember correctly. And if you want to peel off the wrapping there that I just had in case anyone peeked under the cover.
Curious Evolve.
Curious Evolve. So about $500 odd against about $100 odd.
And I don't know about you, but from what I heard out of the two of them,
you prefer that one?
yeah, number one all over.
Yep. And I haven't looked at the results for quite a while, so I don't know what the final results said.
Okay.
But we will soon see what we prefer.
What did you see? I know, like I said, it wasn't the end results.
Yep.
But what did you see when you were looking at it?
So, just bring myself around. What did I see? So, the key thing I saw, and I'll talk more about this in the actual video, but the key thing I saw was that the results were a bit split between configuration 1 and 2. The thing that stood out to me the most was the fact that I don't know where to look at you on the camera here. The thing that stood out to me most was the fact that the reasons people gave for their preference was really consistent. So if people liked the Curious Evolve cable more, they cited similar reasons all the time. So they all said it had more space, or it was a bit warmer, or whatever the things were, and I can't remember off the top of my head now, but I'll find a way to represent that data and show the trends. When they liked the Super Excalibur one more, they again had similar but different reasons for that one. So that was the thing that really stood out to me was A, people could hear a difference, that's really clear, and B, there were different preferences as to which one they liked, but there was consistency as to why they liked it, which I thought was really cool. Yeah.
Well, that's really astounding to me, and that's
Bit of a shock?
yeah, it is a bit of a shock, and it's made me go, oh wow, I might need to have to look at my cables.
Okay, did you think USB cables would make a
No,
difference?
I thought you were running it through two different computers and we're doing the DSD versus PCM or something on the software side of things. So that's really cool.
Cool. Well, thanks for unwrapping it for us. That's awesome.
No, thanks. Thanks for showing me the source. That's,
my pleasure. Now, having seen that, are you shocked? Are you surprised? Is it kind of what you might have expected? Let me know in the comments down below what you think about this revelation. And Peter, if you're watching, it'd be great if you can pop a comment down below about what went through your head when you saw that reveal. Obviously, you said some things on camera for us, and thank you so much for participating. But as you've reflected on it, thought more about it, let us know down below if you've got anything else to add. It looked to me like Peter was pretty surprised at what he found, and I'm guessing that a number of you are going to be pretty surprised as well. At this point, I wish I could give you a definitive answer as to to why the USB cables are able to make a difference. But this test to me has been pretty conclusive at showing that the majority of people can hear a difference between two different USB cables on otherwise identical systems. Something else I should mention, and I didn't say this at the beginning because I didn't want to colour your expectations as we moved forward, but those USB cables themselves, and I didn't want to mention it because I didn't want to talk about USB cables, those USB cables that were coming out of the TT2 were both fed into exactly the same laptop, and it was running JRiver Media Center, playing back all lossless FLAC files, and it was playing out both USB cables as linked devices. So if you're not familiar with JRiver, what it allows you to do is actually set up multiple zones, and you can then link those zones together so they're getting exactly the same feed going to both. And so people could hear exactly the same file, played only through a different USB cable, into the exact same devices at the exact same volume, into the exact same headphones. So literally the only variable in this chain was the USB cable. I know that's going to come as a shock to some of you. I still can't explain it, but it absolutely showed me that I'm not crazy, and what I've been hearing for all these years with different USB cables is absolutely going on. The next step is to find out why, but this, in my opinion, is a great step in the right direction. And so I'm going to wrap this one up here. As I said, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. Please keep it civil down in the comments. If you find a way to disagree with this test and poke holes in it, if you do it respectfully, I'll take it on board and see if we can implement even better processes next time. But if you're just going to abuse us for saying something that you don't agree with and you're not willing to consider, then please just refrain from commenting. For everybody else, I welcome your comments, your thoughts, your feedback, etc. down in the comments. I look forward to reading it. For those of you that want to get involved in the next one of these though, let me now tell you what I've got in mind. I'm going to be chatting to somebody that's got an appropriate venue, and then also some of the distributors and retailers that I now know who might be able to provide some equipment. And what I'm hoping to set up is an occasional, maybe 2 to 3 times per year, an occasional gathering where I can set up similar blind tests like this. That doesn't mean it's always going to be cable related. We might do different digital interconnects, different digital protocol connections. We might do analog interconnects. We could do different DACs, whether it's R2R versus Delta Sigma, or just 2 different DACs at different price points using similar designs. We could do different amp types, discrete versus an integrated amp. There are so many different things we could do. So if that's of interest to you and you'd be able to get to Melbourne easily for say a Sunday afternoon type session for a few hours, if that's of interest to you and you'd like to be involved, make sure you hit the subscribe button. I don't have any set plans yet. There's nowhere you can go to sign up for this yet. So you're going to have to watch out on the channel. I'll announce things through the community feed and on videos as I get more of this plan in action. So make sure you subscribe, ring the notification bell, hit the like button. All of these things are going to make sure that you see anything I put out in the future, and so you can stay in the loop and get involved in the next blind test. And as I said before, for those with ideas and feedback, drop them in the comments. I'll take them on board and we'll build them into future tests. For now though, I hope you found this video as enlightening and interesting as I found the testing process. And I just want to remind you of something that the data showed us, and that is that there is no right and wrong in this hobby. If you prefer the cheaper cable, use the cheaper cable. There is absolutely no better or worse when it comes to subjective music enjoyment. So enjoy the gear you've got. Even if someone else somewhere on a forum tells you that it's trash, don't worry about that. If you enjoy it, if you're having fun listening to your music, that's what matters, and continue to do it. And so with that said, I'm going to leave you to the music. Happy listening. Sorry if I've just made you go and play with a whole bunch of USB cables to find out which one you like the sound of most. But hopefully I can provide more guidance in future videos. And until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.